On March 6, 1944, high above Germany, a B-17 flying fortress was flying straight into hell. 23,000 feet in the air, enemy territory below, German fighters closing in from behind. And inside the tail of that bomber, squeezed into one of the most dangerous positions in the entire war, was a young American gunner named Michael Donovan. The men in his crew called him Mad Mike. And in just a few minutes, that nickname would become famous. Because coming toward him were not one or two enemy planes. There were 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s forming up behind the bomber. 12 hunters, one bomber, one tail gunner, and almost everyone on board knew what the rulebook said. Wait, hold your fire, conserve ammunition, let the fighters come closer, shoot only when you're sure. That was the official way to survive. But Donovan looked at those German fighters and made a decision that sounded insane. He was not going to wait for them to attack. He was going to attack first. And what happened next shocked his crew, confused the Germans, and changed the way bomber crews thought about survival in the sky. Before we go deeper, if you enjoy forgotten war stories like this, stories of men who changed history in seconds, hit the like button and subscribe, because the most powerful parts of this story are still coming. Michael Donovan was not the kind of man who waited for trouble to find him. He grew up in South Boston, where life taught him a simple rule early. If you hesitate, you lose. His father worked on the docks. His older brother boxed. And Mike learned that fear was not something you escaped. It was something you moved through. By the time America entered the war, Donovan already had the mindset of a fighter. Not a polished officer, not a textbook soldier, a fighter. When he joined the Army Air Forces, they wanted to place him with ground crews. He refused. He wanted the guns. At gunnery school, instructors noticed something different about him. He was not the most disciplined, he was not the calmest, and he was definitely not the safest. But he was fast, faster than almost anyone they had trained. Most gunners waited for enemy fighters to enter their zone. Donovan was already tracking them before they became a threat. Most gunners reacted. Donovan hunted. One instructor warned him that his style was too aggressive, too risky, too close to suicide. Donovan's answer was simple. A dead gunner can't protect anyone. A live one shoots first. That answer followed him through training. Some men laughed at it. Some thought he was reckless. But the men who flew with him would later understand exactly what he meant. By early March of 1944, Donovan was assigned to a B-17 bomber crew flying out of England. Their aircraft had already earned a dark reputation. The bomber had survived missions, but barely. German fighters had torn into it more than once. The previous tail gunner had survived. But after his last mission, he asked to be transferred. He told the crew chief that the tail position was cursed. The next man in that seat, he said, would not come home. When Donovan heard that, he volunteered. Not later. Not after thinking it over. Immediately. The pilot, Captain James Whitmore, wanted to speak to him first. He told Donovan the truth. The tail gunner position was one of the deadliest places on a B-17. You were isolated. You were exposed. You were the first man German fighters wanted to silence. Whitmore asked him if he understood the odds. Donovan did. Then he said something that made the captain stare at him. "If they're coming for me, sir, I'd rather meet them halfway." Whitmore didn't smile. He just studied him for a few seconds and said, "You're either crazy or exactly what we need." Donovan's first missions proved one thing fast. He did not fight like the other gunners. Standard doctrine was defensive. Let the enemy commit. Open fire only when necessary. Save ammunition for later attacks. Donovan believed that was backwards. To him, waiting gave the Germans control. They chose the angle. They chose the timing. They chose who fired first. And in a bomber, if the enemy controlled the first move, men died. So Donovan started shooting earlier, not always to destroy, sometimes just to break their rhythm. A short burst at long range could force a German pilot to adjust. That adjustment could ruin an entire attack pattern. To other gunners, it looked like wasted ammunition. To Donovan, it was a trade. 20 rounds to save a bomber. 20 rounds to make a fighter hesitate. 20 rounds to keep 9 men alive. He would take that deal every time. On one mission, he noticed something most men missed. German fighters often attacked in pairs or groups. The lead fighter drew attention. The wingman stayed behind him, waiting for the gunner to focus on the wrong target. Most American gunners aimed at the lead aircraft. Donovan aimed at the wingman, because the wingman thought he was safe, and when the wingman suddenly took fire, the whole attack collapsed. That became Donovan's obsession, not just shooting planes down, breaking the attack before it became deadly. At night, instead of sleeping, he studied German tactics, how they lined up, how they approached, where they hesitated, where they expected American gunners to look. And the more he studied, the more one idea formed in his mind. The Germans were not winning because they had better courage. They were winning because American gunners were letting them make the first move. So Donovan asked himself one dangerous question. What happens if the bomber stops defending and starts attacking? Then came March 6th, 1944. The mission briefing was grim. The target was deep inside Germany. Heavy resistance expected. Enemy fighters likely. Losses possible. Every man in the room understood what that meant. Some crews would not return. Captain Whitmore gathered his men before takeoff and told them to stay sharp. But Donovan had already made up his mind. He asked permission to try something different. Aggressive fire. Engage the fighters before they committed. Force them to react before they could attack. Whitmore did not like it at first. It meant using more ammunition. It meant exposing the bomber's position. It meant gambling with the one resource a tail gunner could not replace in the air. But Donovan pushed back. He said they had spent years playing defense, and defense was still getting men killed. Whitmore gave him one chance, one mission, one test. If Donovan was wrong, he would never touch that gun again. The B-17 lifted off before sunrise. The crew formed up with the bomber stream. They crossed the channel. They climbed into the cold, thin air. For a while, everything felt routine. Engines humming, oxygen masks tight, men quiet with the kind of silence that only exists before combat. Then the call came over the intercom. Fighters, 6 o'clock high. Donovan turned his guns. There they were, 12 Bf-109s, still distant, still forming, still outside the range where most gunners would even think about firing. And that was exactly the moment Donovan wanted. He squeezed the trigger. The twin 50 caliber machine guns came alive. Tracers ripped through the sky. Most of them missed. At that distance, they were supposed to miss, but they did not need to hit. They needed to disturb, and they did. The German formation broke apart before the attack even began. The lead fighter banked away. The wingmen scattered. The neat, deadly shape behind the bomber dissolved into confusion. Whitmore shouted over the intercom for Donovan to stop wasting ammunition. Donovan answered without taking his eyes off the sight. Watch what they do next. And what they did next changed everything. The German fighters regrouped, but not with the same confidence. They were slower now, more cautious. They were no longer diving in like predators. They were probing, testing, reacting. And that meant Donovan had stolen the initiative. One fighter came in more aggressively than the others. A veteran, probably. The kind of pilot who did not scare easily. Donovan let him come closer. 1,400 yards, 1,200, 1,000. The German pilot held course. Then Donovan opened up. Not a warning burst, not a tap. A full, violent stream of fire. The fighter tried to brake, but it was too late. Rounds tore into the aircraft. The engine erupted. The plane came apart and fell. The crew saw it. One German fighter gone. But Donovan was not celebrating. He was already looking for the next one. And this is where the story gets even crazier. Because after losing one aircraft, the Germans changed tactics. They split their attack. Some came from 6 o'clock. Others shifted to the side. They wanted to divide the bomber's guns, force confusion, make Donovan choose wrong. But he had expected this. Instead of chasing every threat, he focused completely on the most dangerous group. He trusted the waist gunners to handle the side attack. He held the rear. 6 fighters came straight in. Donovan picked the lead plane and fired. Hit! The fighter exploded. He shifted instantly to the next. Fired again. Another fighter went down. In less than a minute, 3 German fighters had fallen. Now imagine being one of the remaining pilots. You are used to American bombers waiting. You are used to tail gunners reacting late. You are used to being the hunter. And suddenly, one bomber is shooting first, breaking formations and killing aircraft before the attack can even develop. The Germans pulled away, not because the battle was over, because they needed to understand what they were facing. At this point in the story, comment below, Would you have fired early like Donovan? Or would you have followed the official rules and saved ammunition? I want to know what you would have done in that tailgun seat. The bomber continued toward the target, but the sky was not done with them. More German fighters appeared. This time, more organized, more aggressive. They had seen what happened to the first group. Now they came from multiple angles. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock. They were trying to overwhelm the bomber from every rear quarter at once. The normal response would have been to spread fire everywhere. Try to cover all angles. Try to survive. Donovan chose something else. He ignored the distractions. He focused on the direct threat. The fighters coming straight at the tail. 6 Bf-109s were diving toward him, closing fast. At that speed, he had only seconds. He opened fire at long range and walked the tracers into the lead plane's path. The German pilot held formation. That was the mistake. At 800 yards, Donovan's rounds found the aircraft. The canopy shattered. The fighter rolled and fell away. Donovan shifted again. No time to think. No time to breathe. Only instinct. He fired not where the next plane was, but where it had to be. The second fighter flew straight into the stream. The engine blew apart. Another German aircraft vanished in flame. Inside the bomber, the crew could barely believe what they were seeing. Whitmore's voice came over the intercom, stunned. Donovan just got 2 more. But Donovan was already checking his ammunition, and that was the problem. He was winning the fight, but burning through bullets. The mission was not even halfway done. They still had to reach the target, drop their bombs, turn around, and fly back through the same deadly sky. Then the Germans did something that made Captain Whitmore's stomach drop. They stopped attacking. They stayed outside. Range. Shadowing. Waiting. Watching. Whitmore understood. They were calling in reinforcements. Soon more contacts appeared. Dozens of fighters. The bomber was separated from the main formation. No friendly fighters nearby. No easy protection. Just one B-17, alone in German airspace, with enemy aircraft gathering around it. Donovan checked his remaining ammunition. The numbers were terrible. Too many fighters. Too few bullets. The math did not work, so he changed the math. He called the captain. He asked permission to attack before the Germans finished organizing. Whitmore asked what he meant. Donovan said if they waited 2 more minutes, the Germans would hit them from every side at once. They could not defend against that. But if he fired while they were still forming, he might break the attack before it became coordinated. Whitmore knew it was desperate, but he also knew the alternative. He gave the order. Do it. Donovan did not answer with words. He answered with gunfire. He aimed not at one aircraft, but at the center of the formation, the place where order lived, the place where pilots were trying to line up, hold spacing, and prepare the attack. Then he poured fire into it. Tracers cut through the formation like a blade. One fighter caught fire. 2 others swerved violently. The formation panicked. The entire assault broke apart. For a moment, the sky turned from a coordinated attack into pure chaos. And this is the part that made Donovan's tactic so dangerous. He was not just killing planes. He was killing confidence. He was making trained fighter pilots feel hunted by a bomber. That had never been the normal psychology of the fight. Bombers were supposed to survive. Fighters were supposed to attack. But Donovan had reversed the feeling. Now the attackers were the ones reacting. Now the hunters were unsure. Now one. Tailgun position had become the most dangerous point in the sky. If this story is holding you right now, hit subscribe, because stories like this almost disappeared from history. And the ending of this one is even more unbelievable than the battle itself. The Germans regrouped again. This time, they abandoned perfect formation. They came in like a swarm, fast, angry, determined to finish the bomber. Donovan had very little ammunition left, so every burst had to matter. He picked the center of the swarm, not the nearest fighter, not the loudest threat, the center, the psychological heart of the attack. He fired short bursts. One plane took hits and fell away smoking. Another exploded. A third broke off, but the others kept coming. Now they were close enough for German cannon fire. 20mm shells streaked past the tail. Some hit. The bomber shook. Metal screamed. The tail section took damage. But Donovan stayed on the guns. Target, burst, target, burst. No panic, no wasted movement. Another fighter fell. then another. At point-blank range, the remaining Germans finally broke away. They had come in expecting to destroy a wounded bomber. Instead, they had flown into a wall of fire. Then Donovan squeezed the trigger again. Nothing. The guns were empty. Every round was gone. He called over the intercom. "I'm dry." Those two words should have been a death sentence, because the Germans still had aircraft in the sky. And now they knew the tail guns were silent. They regrouped one last time. This was no longer a battle. It looked like an execution. The fighters moved behind the bomber, directly into the one position Donovan could no longer defend. They came in steady, careful, almost certain. Donovan watched them approach. 400 yards, 300, 200. He had no ammunition, but he still had one weapon left: fear. He turned the empty guns toward the lead fighter, slowly, precisely. He tracked him as if the guns were loaded, as if at any second, fire would rip through the sky again. The German pilot saw those twin barrels pointing at his cockpit, and even though the guns were empty, he broke away. Pure instinct. The lead fighter turned hard. The others followed. The attack collapsed. Not because Donovan fired, because the Germans believed he could. That is the power of reputation. That is the power of aggression. Sometimes the enemy does not need to be hit again. Sometimes he only needs to remember what happened the last time he came too close. The German fighters disengaged. They had paid too high a price. They left the bomber alone. Hell's Fury continued toward the target, dropped its bombs, and somehow made the long flight home. When the B-17 landed back in England, ground crews rushed toward it. The aircraft was torn up. Bullet holes, cannon strikes, damaged control surfaces, hydraulic problems, a cracked and battered tail. But it was there. It had come home. Donovan climbed out of the tail position with steady hands. No dramatic speech, no celebration. Just a man who had spent everything he had to keep his crew alive. The crew chief checked the ammunition boxes. Empty. Every belt, every round. Gone. Captain Whitmore asked for the count. The reports came in from crew members, visual confirmations, and later radio intelligence. 12 confirmed German fighters destroyed, more damaged, all in minutes of brutal combat. One bomber, one tail gunner, a tactic everyone had called suicidal. And yet the crew was alive. By the next morning, the story had spread across the airfield. Other gunners wanted to know exactly what Donovan had done. Pilots wanted briefings. Command wanted answers. Because this was not just a lucky mission. This was a new way of thinking. Donovan explained it simply. Do not wait for the enemy to become dangerous. Make him uncomfortable before he is ready. Break his formation. Break his timing. Break his confidence. If you cannot outnumber him, disrupt him. If you cannot defend everywhere, attack the place that matters most. And if the enemy expects fear, give him aggression instead. That idea became known among crews as Donovan's style of fighting. Aggressive tail gunnery. It was not about firing wildly. It was not about wasting ammunition. It was about using fire as a weapon before the kill. A burst could be a warning. A line of tracers could break a formation. An early attack could force enemy pilots to hesitate. And in air combat, hesitation could mean survival for the bomber. The principles were simple. First, take the initiative. Do not let the enemy decide when the fight begins. Second, use psychology. A frightened enemy makes mistakes. Third, focus your fire. When surrounded, do not chase everything. Hit the threat that holds the attack together. Fourth, spend ammunition to prevent disaster. A few rounds used early can save hundreds later. Fifth, accept that survival sometimes requires moving toward danger, not away from it. Not every gunner could fight this way. Some men froze, some could not fire early, some were too trained to wait. But the ones who understood Donovan's method became far more dangerous. They stopped thinking like trapped men. They started thinking like fighters, and German pilots noticed. They began to recognize the signs: early fire, aggressive tracking, sustained bursts into formation centers. Tracers not just aimed at planes, but aimed at confidence. When they saw that kind of gunner, many broke off before completing the attack. That may sound small, but in the sky, an attack that never happens is a victory. A bomber that does not get hit brings its crew home. A crew that comes home flies again. And slowly, that kind of thinking changed the air war. Donovan did not become a loud hero after that. He did not chase fame. He did not spend the rest of his life telling everyone what he had done. After the war, he returned home, worked, lived quietly, and when people asked about his service, he kept it simple. He did what had to be done. But the men who learned from him never forgot. They remembered the lesson. Survival is not always about hiding. Sometimes survival means becoming so dangerous that the enemy decides you are not worth the cost. That was Donovan's real legacy. Not just the planes he destroyed, not just the mission he survived, but the idea he left behind. A bomber gunner was not just a man waiting to be attacked. He could be the reason the attack never came. On March 6, 1944, high above Germany, Michael Donovan proved something that every soldier, pilot, and fighter understands. Fear grows when you wait. Confidence grows when you act. He fired every round he had. He faced impossible odds. And when the guns went silent, the enemy still feared him. Because by then, the battle was no longer just about bullets. It was about belief. The Germans believed he could still kill them. And that belief was enough to save his crew. 1 tail gunner, 1 bomber, 12 enemy fighters, 4 minutes that turned defense into offense, and 1 lesson written across the sky. Sometimes the only way to survive death is to make death afraid of you first. If this story gave you chills, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. And tell me this, was Donovan reckless? Or was he exactly the kind of man war creates when survival leaves no other choice?